Welcome to this explainer. Okay, if you were watching the news in early 2023, you know the whole high-altitude surveillance balloon saga felt like something, well, straight out of a Cold War sci-fi movie, right? Today, we're cutting through all that noise. We're going to completely demystify the technology, those wild global airspace incursions, and the massive geopolitical friction that followed, all based directly on our source reports. So let's just dive right in.
All right, let's rewind a bit to February 2023. Imagine looking up into a crisp winter sky and seeing a massive, mysterious object hovering up there where normally only commercial jets fly. And this wasn't just anywhere. This thing showed up over Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. And why does that matter? Well, because that specific site houses over 100 nuclear missile silos containing intercontinental ballistic missiles. You can imagine it instantly triggered alarm bells at the absolute highest levels of government.
I thought it was a star, but it was just too big. That's an actual quote from an eyewitness in Montana. It wasn't just the military tracking this thing, you know? Regular people were completely bewildered. Folks were literally looking out their windows, staring at this massive object clearly visible to the naked eye in broad daylight. It was just so bold, so conspicuous that it forced an immediate public reckoning. There was no hiding this thing.
Now, when we hear the word balloon, we tend to think of, a flimsy weather balloon, right? But this was a 200-foot-tall, 2,000-pound behemoth floating up in the upper atmosphere. Think about that. 200 feet tall, and it was carrying a payload the size of a regional passenger jet. Add in massive solar panels for power and suspected propellers, and it becomes clear this craft wasn't just drifting lazily at the mercy of the wind, it actually had a degree of steering capability. To really wrap our heads around why this caused such a massive international uproar, we have to talk about the Kármán line. Basically, this is the internationally accepted boundary, sitting at 62 miles high in altitude, where a nation's sovereign airspace officially ends and outer space begins. Because this balloon was cruising at roughly 60,000 feet, which is only about 11 miles up, it was undeniably operating within sovereign United States airspace, and that is a clear-cut violation of international civil aviation conventions. But honestly, this brings up a genuinely fascinating question. In an era where superpowers have billion-dollar, high-tech satellites, stealth aircraft, and these invisible cyber warfare tools, why on earth would anyone rely on a seemingly low-tech, highly visible balloon for surveillance? It seems almost archaic, doesn't it?
Well, it actually comes down to a really interesting capability gap in modern espionage. Think about our spy satellites for a second. Low Earth orbit, or LEO satellites, are relatively close to the ground for great image resolution. But they whip around the globe super fast, like every 90 minutes, so they can't just hover over one spot. Geosynchronous satellites, on the other hand, match the Earth's rotation to continuously watch one specific location. But the catch is they're positioned thousands of miles away, which makes ultra-clear photography incredibly difficult.
And this is exactly where high-altitude balloons bridge the gap perfectly. They fly quietly and sit way closer to the ground than any satellite ever could, allowing them to capture crystal-clear imagery. Yet, they move slowly enough to persistently loiter, just hang out over a specific target for days at a time. Throw in some infrared technology to track heat signatures at night, and suddenly, this archaic balloon starts making brilliant tactical sense.
So, let's look at how this all escalated. Once that primary balloon crossed the continental U.S., an F-22 Raptor, literally one of the world's most advanced $200 million stealth fighters, was deployed to go pop a balloon off the South Carolina coast on February 4th. But as we know, that was just the beginning. This single incident triggered massive radar adjustments, which led to a totally unprecedented, hectic week. In rapid succession, military forces effectively swept the skies, downing 3 more unidentified objects over Alaska, Canada's Yukon, and Lake Huron. Now, while that first balloon was highly documented and recovered, those subsequent objects, they stayed completely shrouded in mystery. Take the Yukon object, for example, officially dubbed UAP-23. Declassified emails described it as a small, metallic, and white cylinder with a 20-foot hanging payload wire. And because it was shot down over these harsh, freezing Canadian mountains in the dead of winter, the search for debris was actually eventually called off. So we still don't have the full public picture of what those secondary objects actually were. Crazy, right? Okay, zooming out from the skies of North America for a second, we have to ask the next logical question. Was this just a freak, isolated event targeted solely at the U.S. and Canada? Or are we looking at a much broader global pattern of surveillance?
As our source reports clearly show, this was absolutely a global phenomenon.
Using artificial intelligence to scan millions of square kilometers of historical satellite imagery, investigators actually confirmed a very similar balloon traveling over northern Japan way back in 2021. And it doesn't stop there. We also have confirmed military sightings off the coast of Taiwan, high over the Andaman Islands in India, and even hovering over Colombia during the exact same week as the U.S. incident.
What's really fascinating here is how wildly the regional responses varied. Like Japan officially stated they were prepared to use weapons to shoot down future balloons. But Latin American nations? They took a completely different path. When a balloon traversed Costa Rica and Colombia, those militaries tracked it, for sure, but they opted for quiet observation. They explicitly stated it wasn't a military threat. Why? Well, they prioritized staying out of the geopolitical fray, choosing to protect their vital economic and development relationships with China over sparking a military confrontation.
And that brings us to the ultimate fallout of this whole saga, the severe diplomatic chill that instantly materialized between Washington and Beijing. It's wild to think about, but the geopolitical ripples caused by this single physical object were absolutely massive. To keep things completely impartial, let's look strictly at the official claims from both sides, starting with the U.S. The United States unequivocally declared the craft a deliberate military intelligence surveillance balloon. From their perspective, it was part of a broader global program, purposely navigated over sensitive military sites, and represented a totally unacceptable violation of American territorial sovereignty. On the flip side, the Chinese government maintained a vastly different narrative. They stated the craft was simply a civilian weather airship utilized for scientific research. According to Beijing, it had limited self-steering and was basically just blown off course by natural weather forces, an act of force majeure. And they strongly criticized the U.S. decision to use a fighter jet to shoot it down, calling it a serious overreaction to a simple weather event. Now, regardless of whose narrative you believe regarding the balloon's true intent, the fallout was immediate and very concrete. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken indefinitely postponed a highly anticipated diplomatic trip to Beijing. Chinese military officials flat-out refused crisis hotline calls from the U.S. Defense Secretary. And it quickly hit the economy, too. The U.S. placed severe sanctions on Chinese aerospace companies, and China retaliated by sanctioning U.S. defense contractors. Literally, a single balloon essentially froze relations between the two largest economies on Earth.
So, I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. As we look at the modern operational environment, where we are all so hyper-focused on invisible cyber attacks and insanely expensive space-based technologies, we really have to wonder, do these highly visible, slow-moving physical balloons represent the true new frontier of international espionage? It kind of proves that sometimes the most disruptive technologies are the ones we thought we left in the past. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious and keep learning.